the reality of player workload in Asia, whether it's increased match congestion, long travel distance, or lack of standardized player protection. The FIFPRO is looking to address them and tackle the Asian players' hidden burden. What follows should be strategies, solutions, and a call for action for the long-term health and sustainability of the sport.
Right now, the product that is football is getting more complex, right? It's getting bigger, more games in many places, I mean, in different places, and evidently the level of competition is raising across the globe, which means that, you know, the star players especially need to travel a lot when they play for club or for nation and so on. One of the biggest concerns that any athlete has is workload. Can you share some insights in terms of, or information regarding, you know, how calendar or potentially new formats which have been discussed at length during the event can affect, I would say, positively or negatively, the possibility for players to perform because of workload? If you want, Beau, you can take that one first.
Do you want to go first, or?
Go ahead, Bob. Give us the regional perspective.
Yeah, I think what we've seen play out over the past sort of 3 to 5 years is a significant increase in the workload associated with players, particularly at the highest levels of the sport, which are also the ones that do generate significant commercial revenue to allow the sport to be what it can be. I think what it really highlights is we have a significant governance challenge in the sport. And that if we continue to maintain the status quo in relation to the way the game is governed, we're going to continue to be challenged by this issue. So until we reform the governance of the sport to be able to allow it to work in a more collaborative way that actually brings some much needed coherence to the calendar, it's going to be incredibly difficult to avoid this scenario where we've seen examples of Raphael Varane have to walk away from the national team, citing the impact that those commitments are having on his club career, and players are effectively having to choose between maintaining their livelihood with their club whilst representing their nation, which means a lot to them. So I think certainly from my perspective, what we're seeing is until we address this governance issue, we're going to continue to have the problems where players are actually playing too much and we're putting the product at risk. But also importantly as well too, we're having this issue where we're seeing players actually not playing enough to be able to develop the competitiveness of football, particularly in parts of the region in Asia and Oceania, which is where I primarily work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Beau, especially on Raphael Varane. I think Raphael Varane is really symptomatic of some of the issues that are going on in relation to workload. Switched on the Champions League last night when I got back to the hotel. Varane had just been substituted. I was thinking about what we were going to speak about today, and two pieces of research that came up when we were looking at Varane after he retired last year sprung to mind that I think demonstrate the problem quite well. Firstly, 243 days. That was the time that Varane spent in national team camp between the 2018 World Cup and the final in 2022. Now, that's only on French duty, in addition to his day job or his regular job playing for Manchester United. Imagine what you would do with 243 days over the course of a 4-year period in relation to your spare time, your family life, your recovery, on top of your regular day job. I think that just shows some of the strain that's been placed on today's top players because of the calendar and because of the governance issues that Beau spoke about. And the second stat I would say in relation to Raphael is that the period between his final World Cup match in the final Qatar last year and his first game back with Manchester United was 8 days. After that long period building up to their World Cup and back in club action within 8 days, that's just an insufficient recovery time, not giving the players the rest they need. And I think that just demonstrates another aspect where players are not getting sufficient recovery because of the governance issues and because of the calendar issues.
Yeah, actually, because it's not only the physical recovery, it's also the mental aspect of it. I mean, if you're lucky enough not to get injured, but you know, when you get tired and you get pushed to the limit, actually, it takes a toll mentally. What are things that probably you could share that let's focus on the successful cases of management of players are being done on the mental and the physical realm in terms of player protection?
I think one of the things we've tried to work on domestically in Australia is ensuring that there is sufficient rest at the end of the season, that the players are able to take a step away from the sport to be able to recharge and rebuild their energy to ensure they're at the best when the competition resumes. Now, one of the big challenges we face domestically is we can do that in relation to our leagues and our domestic cup competitions, but where we can't get that sort of level of collaboration is in relation to the international match calendar. So you're still at the mercy of a variety of things that are currently largely outside the control of the players. So I think this really is a fundamental issue for the players, and we're seeing more and more players speak consistently about that. In our own country, in the lead up to the Women's World Cup, we saw our captain Sam Kerr get injured right on the edge of the tournament, and the story about much of the tournament in the lead up to those matches, certainly from Australian perspective, was all around Sam's injury. And as a result of that injury, I think Sam played in excess of sort of 55 matches last year, while there would have been many other players at the same tournament that played as few as sort of 15 to 20 matches that season. So I think what that sort of highlights is that we've still got to get to a point where we can ensure that our players are actually at their best when they come into World Cups and major tournaments that really do drive significant revenue that can be invested back into the sport. If we don't solve that issue and sort of avoidable injuries that are largely the result of load, we'll sort of get stuck in this self-defeating cycle where the game will suffer as a result and fans won't have the opportunity to see the best players play on the biggest stage consistently.
Yeah, and actually going deeper into that, and evidently that this is something that might not be the case in Australia or other more developed, say, countries, but we've seen recently a few cases of, for example, cardiac arrest on players playing, and some of the stories were interesting because in some cases were pre-diagnosed conditions that were treated, but somehow affected the player while practicing. What do you think is missing at a global level, and talking about the collaboration among stakeholders and I suppose medical teams across different levels of the organigram to actually be able to ensure that there is a correct follow-up on those situations?
I think ultimately, and Michael, feel free to jump in here, is global minimum standards that are in place for any major tournament. What we shouldn't see is minimum medical standards put in place for the FIFA World Cup that ensure players are doing comprehensive medical testing, but when they're participating in a tournament that really requires the same demand, say the Asian Champions League or the Asian Cup, we're seeing the absence of those same standards that are really put in place to safeguard the well-being of players. So I think that's something as well, alongside the workload discussion. How do we get to a point in relation to all competitions around the world where if they are a professional tournament, then they really need to have these minimum professional standards in place to be able to safeguard the interests of players? Because once again, if we don't have that in place, how can we have the confidence that players are going to have everything they need to be their best, but also importantly, just have a minimum level of safety around their performance as well?
Yeah. Actually, Michael, wanted to jump and related to that in terms of let's say the interrelation of the different organisms and the stakeholders. Evidently, protocols, regulation, and so it's very difficult. The world is very vast, so things can then trickle down and actually be able to effectively work from a legal perspective or from a local regulation perspective. But what could be, let's say, the 2-3 must-have that the world football family, and those are all the stakeholders, players, clubs, leagues, and national associations, need to have and try to come together to actually create that common framework?
Yeah, well, in relation to workload, and we're talking here the top level players, the top end of the game, so the overload problem, I think there's probably 4 elements that we want to see introduced in our individual discussions with different stakeholders. All of them agree that these 4 elements are important, but together they don't want to give up their piece of the pie as it is. And it's that dynamic of reaching a sustained solution together that's the problem. But the 4 key elements that we want to see improvement on: season breaks. First of all, players are losing their season breaks. They're not getting minimum guaranteed season breaks. Our work with our high performance coach network and some other experts and players and managers revealed that players should have at least 4 weeks every off season guaranteed. When players are playing tournaments and playing other club commitments, that's getting taken away and they're not having time to recover. Season breaks is the first. Second, international travel. Beau is very familiar with from his players. Players are doing a lot of international travel, especially players based or from Asia or South America that play in Europe. Just constant flights back and forth and insufficient recovery time in relation to that. I think competition scheduling is a big factor there that can be maybe tweaked to reduce that. Third factor would be total match load. As Beau mentioned already, the top players are just playing too many matches because there is this convergence of competitions where every competition doesn't want to give up their spaces, and it just led to an increased amount, or an overly increased amount of total games. And then the final point, and possibly the most important point, is that we'd like to see a limitation on back-to-back matches or critical zone minutes that players play. And what that is, what we call a back-to-back match at FIFPRO, is when players play one game within 5 days of the previous game. And the problem with that is that the medical science indicates that a player is not fully recovered from the previous game, medically, and in terms of muscle, and in terms of his body, until 5 days afterwards. So playing before that point puts them at a bigger susceptible risk to injury. Now, it's not realistic that that's never going to happen during the season. Of course, there's economic conditions, there's different competitions, so that's always going to happen, but it's that cumulative exposure if there's long consecutive sequences of these back-to-back games. I think Bruno Fernandes reached 20 last year at one point. I think Lautaro Martinez reached 21. So that's just Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, Wednesday, Sunday, continuously for 20 games in a row. And that's where the real risk comes in, and the real risk of serious injury can gradually go up. So that's those 4 issues, I think, are the 4 things that we'd like to see some action on.
I think with that point as well too, to put that into a context for our national team players that could play on a Thursday in the Europa League, and then play on a Sunday for their Eredivisie club, jump on a flight, a 24-hour flight on the Monday, return to Australia, sort of arrive late on the Tuesday, and then turn around and play an international match on the Thursday in Australia, go back and play somewhere else in Asia on the Tuesday, and then return back to Europe sort of late on Wednesday to play a match on Friday. So clearly, I don't think anyone, to Michael's point, would argue that that's a sustainable way to be able to manage a load of players. But until we start to sort of address this dynamic, which is really confederations operating in isolation from FIFA, domestic competitions and others, it's going to be really difficult to address. All we're seeing is more and more added, and eventually it's going to get to the point where something breaks and there will have to be significant reform. And we'd prefer to get to that point before we actually, get to a point where it's completely broken. So I think that's really important from our perspective, that we get there as swiftly as possible, because we see with our players that it isn't sustainable, and also to prepare a national team to be at their best when they come home, 5 or 6 times a year. That's not lending itself to that either.
Yeah, actually, now we are potentially in the advent of upheaval and change of the professional competition calendar at different levels, different regions and confederations. But there's a common denominator, which seems to be more demanding games. So the famous more games amongst the best, but that comes as a cost, right? Is there anything that you can suggest already in terms of any type of simulation or projection in terms of what could be that potential impact, even if it's at a regional level, of what more games could mean for the already, I suppose, and I get dire situation as it is, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think, Michael could speak to the global research more than I can, but we've worked pretty extensively in relation to the Asian Champions League and looking at the percentage of match minutes played by players in the critical zone again, that where we're seeing players play that sort of Wednesday, Saturday. And the really sort of critical thing that's emerged from that is the correlation with injury from that is significantly higher. So where we sort of need to move to is deeply understanding the impact that this is having on the product, and also the labour, obviously, with the players. So if we address that, do we get to a better position where less becomes more, rather than this winner takes all, which becomes incredibly difficult because you're going to be relying on a smaller pool of players and super clubs to drive the whole economic model of the sport. And I think one of the things that we can sort of look to learn from is how do we change the economic model of the sport in a way that aligns everyone's interests, in a way that allows for greater collaboration. There's some good examples of that have been done in relation to the World Cup and the payments that are made to clubs for players representing their nation at that particular time. It creates a shared incentive around producing national team players, but really that's in isolation from the rest of the way the sport works. In Asia, we'll see our national team players taken out of their major European clubs for the majority of January. So they're absent for that period of time. That has an impact on the clubs that employ them and continue to employ them during that period when they're not there. Has an impact on the individual player who's trying to forge their sort of livelihood in that region. And there's no sort of significant win for the club in that way as well too, where the World Cup's a little bit different. So there are models of where I think this can be done better. And if you get the fundamentals right, which is primarily around the economics, which are an enabler for the sport, then I think you're able to move forward from there. But that's where I think you need to sort of look at where are the problems and aligning people's interests, and that allows you to build a better solution rather than sort of try and jump to a solution, but the same contributing factors are there.
Actually, it's interesting. I'm a basketball guy. I've been a basketball executive for majority of my adult life, and I saw a time in which we had a more tidy calendar in basketball. So you have professional club, then you have a break, then you had national team duty, and that seemed to work well. All of a sudden, we understand as a community, not personally, but that we should copy football and try to insert what we call windows in basketball, which for me is one of the worst ideas of football that we're copying, because it allows for a disconnection from the product, from the audience, and also the impossibility of management in terms of player availability, because it's stop and go from Europe to South America and so on. And you're starting to see now the results. Powerhouses in basketball are getting not in the Olympics, not in the World Cup and so on, and it's because of that. So if you could reset it, it's something that you think is manageable, that model of windowing the calendar, or is better to have the tidy blocks of yesterdays?
I'll let you start off. And
I don't think it's realistic to go back to the start, especially in men's football. I think women's football probably presents that opportunity you're talking about, Rayde, because it's obviously at a different level of professionalization, and it probably has a bit more of that blank slate to create that calendar we want. I know there's discussions ongoing at the moment. UEFA have just set up a second European competition for women, and I think that opportunity probably exists a bit more, to be a bit more creative on the women's side. The men's side, I think, is pretty entrenched, and it's going to be little tweaks here and there which make the benefit or make the difference. But I think the women's game is interesting because we've actually done a project on it, and I know other organizations have, in terms of what is the best way forward to prevent some of the ills of the calendar that have come in the men's game, stop those happening in the women's game, and make a more sustainable game on that side of things.
Yeah, I think it could. You look at what we have on the women's side at the moment, every team's kind of journey to the Women's World Cup is different. In Asia, it's through the Asian Cup. In other parts of the world, it's through World Cup qualifiers. On the men's side is more established in a certain way. But if you look at again in Asia, how that works, there's the sort of first round of World Cup qualifiers, and that sees many of the sort of David versus Goliath type battles, and there's a question over whether that raises the standards of the smaller nations, whether they need more matches against similar sort of, I guess, FIFA ranking other nations, and then allowing the bigger nations to play each other more consistently, whether that would lead to better outcomes. I think there's an opportunity to really look at that. What we've seen in Europe is the emergence of the Nations League, but that hasn't sort of been tied in with World Cup qualification, for example. So it's just adding more rather than saying, if we add more, can we actually tie that into things such as World Cup qualifiers and other ways, and look at it in a more cohesive way, would be really important from my perspective. But we're seeing that play out in Asia now, where the sort of first round of World Cup qualifiers for nations like Australia, Japan and South Korea really don't get a huge amount of fan interest. The players, it deeply matters to them. They want to earn the right to play at a World Cup, but equally they want a competition structure that's going to deliver a more competitive version of Asian football. And at the moment, we're not really seeing that sort of payoff happen. So it's hard to buy into something if it's not achieving this overall sort of broader objective. It's just adding more to the calendar, then it's difficult for the players to continue down that path.
Yeah, adding more quantity, but not necessarily efficiency, which is It's everything you go against as a business. Yeah. So actually, and Michael hinted to the women's game, which evidently is I would say, and I agree with the greatest opportunity of the industry, because you can actually craft, let's say, a rising interest in a product. It is very competitive, and actually you can actually mold what should be a semi-perfect model through there. But in the meantime, what are the things that both at the local level in Australia or regionally in Asia, you are doing to ensure that the women's game and the players are protected in that growth that they're receiving?
I think we sort of have two collective agreements in Australia at the moment. One for the national teams, which is a true gender equality deal that basically establishes a revenue sharing model between the two teams and divides those two pots. Now, what happened in 2019 when we established that, it was primarily the male players that were generating the majority of revenue there. But now we fast forward to 4 years on, and it sort of fluctuates up and down between the two teams, and we're actually seeing a greater demand for our women's players in terms of commercial and also bums on seats at stadiums as well. So we've seen a big shift there. And one of the most important things that we wanted to do in that was ensure the workplace minimum standards for men and women were the same, so our female players could be at their best, and that there was an equal level of investment off the pitch as well too, in terms of marketing, etc. In the leagues, it's a bigger challenge because it's a bigger cohort of players being able to execute that same type of model. But what's been really important is trying to get to a minimum level of matches that would make us internationally competitive. So getting that well above the sort of 20 matches a year plus final series, that's been really important. Establishing minimum standards in terms of staffing as well too for players, travel conditions, in terms of facilities as well too, has been really important to give our female players the best possible workplace experience so they can be at their best. And the idea being that that really sits at the heart of driving a viable commercial product as well too. The fans have got a lot of choice. They're spoilt in Australia. It's one of the most competitive sports markets in the world. So that means that we need to ensure the product is the best it can be. And that really starts with ensuring players have the best possible workplace conditions.
Absolutely. Would you, Michael? What do you say from a more global perspective?
Yeah, no, I think it just has to be made sustainable. I think it's made a lot of strides in the last couple of years with the Euros taking off, the World Cup last year. I think I have to commend Beau and the work that his organisation does, particularly on the women's side. They're one of our leading organisations in attaining good standards and good conditions for women. But no, I think just have to continue the success, especially the top players. But as Beau said, it's the disparity that's currently hurting the game. The difference between top and bottom is probably just too big at the moment. It's about trying to professionalize that lower level and that medium level, just to bring it up to a certain base level where it makes it quite competitive and sustainable for the game.
Absolutely. And to wrap up and link into our previous panel, wanted to ask you both to take on, let's say, what future trends you see, not to try to think too much into the future, but something that is a reach, especially in terms of technology and how that affects players' well-being, and how it could even affect their employability for good or even for bad. We are in the era of AI, but there are many other technologies that can be at the service of player development. So I wanted to take your position or your vision in terms of what we can expect in the future.
I think, to that point, there's absolutely far more monitoring going on with players now. A player's life from when they step into a club in the morning to when they leave in the evening, and even when they're asleep at home, everything's being monitored. I think what really goes to the heart of sort of the discussion around calendar is we have more and more data that's telling us the same thing. So it's not a question of capacity. We do understand the impact that this is having. It's actually a question of will. So as technology actually grows more and more, that's fantastic, but we need to have the will to actually act on the findings. That's the part that I think the industry really needs to get to grips with. Technology is wonderful, but it's an enabler for a broader strategy and a broader commitment to safeguarding the interests of players. If we just simply get more inputs telling us the same thing and we say this is wonderful, we're getting those, but we're actually not acting on those, then it sort of becomes meaningless in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Rayde. Something we're doing a lot of work on at the moment in terms of trying to make players aware of the dangers that are coming down the line, also the benefits, but I think they're a bit more obvious, but then also make them aware of some of the dangers that are coming. For example, we've met with a couple of providers of technology that would be currently in a hospital environment, type scanning, biometrics type scanning equipment, that in future could be plugged into, say, the Hawkeye feed or the feed that has been used to screen the games. And within a couple of minutes, you can biomechanically analyze weaknesses in players' joints, whether it's their ankle, like left ankle, right hip, things like that. That information, once it's transparent and everyone knows about it, and the players are aware what it's being used for, is beneficial because you can prehab or you can train and work and try iron out your deficiencies. But if it's been used covertly, or clubs are using it, or teams are using it without players' knowledge, and say it's then influencing contract negotiations, and you go in for your contract negotiation and the club says you're more susceptible to a hamstring injury, we're going to give you this X amount less or X amount reduced, that's when it becomes a problem. So I think you're right, there's a lot of interesting things coming that present a lot of opportunities once it's transparent and once it's kind of a regulated area, but there's certain dangers posed to players as well if it's used incorrectly.
No, I guess the new European directive in terms of how AI could be used in terms of employability plays a role there. So, Michael and Beau, thank you very much for the conversation. I think it's very useful, and hopefully we can continue to speak of other issues because these ones have been resolved. So please, warm applause for our panelists, and thank you for being here, all of you.